I like every kind of schnitzel sandwich, but to me, I think a schnitzel sandwich in pita with minimal toppings is the way to go. Freshly fried or alternatively cold. I like cold schnitzel sandwiches on a Martin's potato roll with tahini, za'atar, and tomato. Dude,
I like that.
At the beach, it is
it's so good.
So good, yeah.
You're listening to the Taste Podcast. I'm Editor-in-Chief Matt Rodbard, here with Senior Editor Anna Hezel.
Today on the show, we have Mike Solomonov, chef and owner of the restaurants Zahav and Abe Fisher in Philadelphia, and he's the co-author of the new book Israeli Soul. Later on in the show, we'll be talking to Andrea Sloniker and Dana Frank, the authors of the new book Wine Food, New Adventures in Drinking and Cooking. But Matt, what was it like catching up with Mike? How is he doing? What's he up to?
It's always good to catch up with Mike. I've known him for years. He's one of America's most brilliant chefs, straight up. We talk about his great new book where he travels around Israel, diving into some of the country's major food groups like falafel, hummus, schnitzel, and sabich.
Are there any recipes in the book that really kind of blew you away, or any that you're really excited to try?
Funny you ask, Anna. There is this recipe that when I read it, I was like, this can't be true. It is a 5-minute hummus recipe. Now, hummus is a recipe that usually takes several days. You have to soak the chickpeas. You have to shell the chickpeas. You have to boil, and it takes several days. He's like, screw that. Use canned chickpeas. Use tahini. Put in the blender. It's 5 minutes. It's all good. I love it.
Is there an Instant Pot involved somewhere in the process?
Thank God there are no Instant Pots involved in this recipe. But he does talk about Ashkenazi food in a really unique way. Ashkenazi food being the food of European Jews who immigrated to Israel. It's a really, it's a complicated story that he is able to really whittle down into a small section of the book. He tells the story brilliantly, and it's something that's often overlooked in writing about Israel, and he does such a wonderful job.
Here's Matt talking to Mike.
Mike Solomonov, thanks for joining the Taste Podcast.
Thanks for having me, bro.
It's so good to see you. I know you've been running around. I wanted to start with a story that's really funny for our family. We talk about it often, is when my father-in-law, my Abba, who was born in Israel, dined at Zahav.
Yeah.
And then the next night we were at Abe Fisher, and we were doing an event down there for Koreatown, and you'd hosted us, and it was a really fun event, and you came out to our table, and Abba's there, and you're like, oh, how is Zahav? And he's like, I don't understand why the kids are lining up for vegetables.
Right.
I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I was like, my wife was like kind of disappearing under the table at that point.
I know, but I was like, dude, I'm Israeli. Like, at least I'm getting an honest answer from him, No, I mean, I think that is the way it goes, and it's really nice to not have anything fluffed, But it's also cool, I think, when like Israelis come in, whether they like it or whether they don't like it, the fact that they have got this place that they can go to,
And by the way, he loved Abe Fisher, and he actually did love it. I think the pomegranate lamb shank was like licked off the bone, so he liked Zahav. He just so is this the typical or atypical Israeli response to Zahav in Philly?
I think that food is obviously like a really personal thing. Israelis are highly opinionated, and I don't think that you can compete with like the Safta Saba or like local restaurant factor. Like hummus in Israel, everyone has got their favorite and the best, and like under no circumstances would any of them come here and think that mine would be better than the hummus that they grew up with. But I would argue that I think ours is great. Contextually speaking, I'm never going to be able to compete with that,
You opened up the hummus conversation. I have to jump right in about hummus. You write colorfully in the book about how hummus in Israel is its own special thing, and how the brands we have here in the States is its own thing as well.
Yeah.
That's a whole podcast. It's a whole series. But I want to know about your hummus recipe in the book, which is kind of insane and awesome. It's a 5-minute hummus recipe. And it really, you quote, it takes a medium step forward for mankind.
Yeah.
Which I think is really funny.
Well, we wanted to, for Israeli Soul, what we wanted to do is really strip things away. And we went to Israel and shot basically like 8 days of Israel. And then we came back with all this information, and we're like, what is the book going to be? So, and then we decided to shoot it. I was living in this like 1-bedroom apartment with like a crappy kitchen. And the premise of like the food should be that it could be cooked in that kitchen, right? So we cooked all the food in my kitchen and shot all of it on the floor of my apartment. And the idea was that, I want, like, I've got 2 little kids. Like, I want to be able to make this hummus and not really break a sweat, So we start with a can. Like, all the metrics are done the way that you would actually purchase it. You have one food processor to clean, and that literally makes everything. And that was kind of the way that we wanted to.
So
to be.
This is like the long-standing recipe, to my understanding, has been dried chickpeas a day at least, and then you have to cook them for several hours.
Cook them, drain them, that sort of thing.
But take us through your 5-minute recipe, which is pretty amazing.
It's basically you start with like a food processor, and then you add to it raw tahini. But in the portion that you sort of buy it in,
Like you say one jar, right?
It's like a jar, and then it's like water that you loosen up the bottom. The bottom of the tahini, you need to like add water to. That, lemon, garlic, salt, cumin, can of chickpeas. But what you do is you process the tahini first. So
like your sauce.
Exactly. And then you add the chickpeas to that.
No baking soda,
nope.
None of that.
Nope. It's nice, dude.
I've yet to try it.
5 minutes. You do 10-minute abs, 5-minute hummus. You're like all good.
I like that. I like in the photos too, you're using like 365 Whole Foods branded, which I think is legit. Like, you're not trying to say that you need to even source.
No. We want it to be unpretentious and approachable. And I think that, in the large sort of scheme of things has been our approach in general, is how we practice hospitality and food.
You're really democratizing this cuisine. I mean, I think when you say you have to source X, Y, Z, it's very challenging to cook this food.
Nobody wants, like, when you're like, start with an eye of newt. You're like, come on, And especially with something that's already kind of misunderstood. I mean, we want to make it easy and approachable. And when you eat in Israel, it's not like, my grandmother would still prefer to use like canola oil over most things. They didn't have tons of stuff. What they had was very good vegetables, a good source of spices, good dairy. But it was really the effort that they sort of put in,
I want to talk about, this book is a cookbook, but it's also a travel book. You speak about the 9 days you spent in Israel. I love the photos. It's really rich in storytelling. But let's talk about Israel, the size of New Jersey. And for our listeners who may not have been there, the terroir and the climate is so different for such a small place. Can you explain north to south what you're going to find?
Yeah, I mean, I always have to try to answer what Israeli cuisine is, and it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean,
I avoided that question.
Oh, thank you, even though I guess I'm sort of answering it now. But yeah, it is a very, very small country. It has got snow and mountains, and it has got desert, and it has got the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret, which is a lake. It has got sort of rolling grassy hills. It has got fantastic dairy production, grain production. I mean, it was the birthplace of it was the Mesopotamian Peninsula was where agriculture started, and it's where modern agriculture has also started, where ancient and modern winemaking has happened. The convergence of the spice and the Silk Road, 100 different cuisines that have either made their way back or cuisines that were sort of developed there. It's got Jewish cuisine, it has got Muslim, it has got Christian, it has got Armenian, it has got European, Middle Eastern.
You talk about the Ashkenazi influence in the book quite a bit, all the European.
Well, we wanted to do that because I feel like the Ashkenazi food gets a really bad rap, and that is something that distinguishes it a lot from just Middle Eastern, or what people think is just Middle Eastern. I mean, even delving into Palestinian cuisine, and not just from the West Bank or from Jerusalem, but Gaza versus versus the North, and the importance of recognizing those two, and recognizing Palestinian food in general, which I think
that's
is kind
very
of the next
clear.
step.
You're really are looking at all points of view. I have a question about Ashkenazi, and you answer it so colorfully in the book, and in a very, very limited amount of words, which is hard to do. Why did Ashkenazi food not really stick around, and why did Sephardic cuisine? Why was that kind of what ended up lasting?
Well, I think that in general, I feel like Ashkenazi food. I mean, from Israel's point of view, European influence and European culture was not good. That's what, Israeli forefathers didn't want, like the weak European Jew, right? Yep. And even the Holocaust was the way that Holocaust survivors were treated and are treated in Israel today is not great. The government wanted this sort of strong, Israeli, whatever that was, and I think that even though Europeans were the ones that were still fighting War of Independence and right after the Holocaust. I mean, it was not beneficial in terms of like propaganda from the government, and I think that also there wasn't a lot of access to great food at the time. Margarine was used. I mean, my dad didn't have butter for the first 10 years.
My father-in-law was born in the early 50s on kibbutz. So
there wasn't a lot of anything.
Wasn't a lot of anything going on there.
Certainly with the European food, and the way that we understand European Jewish food here in the States is like deli, or it's like overcooked chicken and blintzes. The mushrooms, right? The different sort of fortified wines, the berries, the foraging. Everybody that came over here and everybody that came to Israel was super poor. This is right. So, so turn of the century here in the States, they left with nothing. After World War II, coming to Israel, left with absolutely nothing, including like less 6 million people and family members. So culinary wasn't a big thing. They all left super poor. And so all these like old culinary traditions were left a little bit behind. And then you add that to the stigma of like a weak, like pasty European Jew. It doesn't help
in the
out.
desert, yeah.
And then Sephardic food, or I shouldn't say Sephardic because, I mean, not just Sephardic Spanish, but North African, Mizrahi, everything from the East, all the communities that came back from Yemen, from North Africa, all over Arabia, food is just more exotic and more fun and more exciting.
Well said, because when you say you've set up the context of why this fun and exciting cuisine has kind of shaped the identity of Israeli cuisine, and just thank you for saying that. Let's talk about why it is so fun and exciting. What are some of the...
Well, I have to actually go back a little bit and say, so the misconception, though, is that Ashkenazi cooking is not fun and exciting.
All right, so
vibrant,
we'll go to...
But, and we highlight this in the book, there's a couple of restaurants, particularly in Haifa, and there's still some in Yaffo, too, that are off the beaten path, that don't get the press, that aren't buzzy, that aren't like tons of tahina, and they're amazing.
What are some of the dishes you're having at these?
So, I mean, I think like all the pickles are freaking awesome. These whole pickled green tomatoes. It's still acid. It's still salinity. It's still spice. It's just not the things that have marketed Israeli food right now. But if you go to like Mayin Habira, which means like spring of beer or whatever, in Haifa, it is the same. Your table gets covered with tiny little salads, with tiny pickles, with, grilled tongue on top of like giant beans. I mean, like amazing food. It just hasn't gotten the same sort of press, the same buzz. It's not as colorful.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of this exotic nature for the quote unquote Sephardic cuisine.
Of course, it's like forbidden. It's like mystery,
It's mystery.
Yeah.
I love that you call it a lot of restaurants in the book. In the beginning of the book, there's a nice glossary. I want to talk about a couple of them that I've been to. One is Azura.
Sick.
In Jerusalem. I love that restaurant.
Dude, I think it's like, listen, the beautiful thing about eating in Israel is that there are all the new restaurants that are like awesome, that are popping up by like younger chefs. And now chefs in Israel are embracing Israeli cuisine. It's no longer like go abroad and then come back and make like Italian food. Like they are looking at what they grew up with and recognizing the excitement and the vibrancy, right? So you've got younger chefs, like people our age, that are making sick food. And then, so you got those new restaurants. And then you've got the new restaurants that I use like in air quotes that have been around for like 100 years that you've just never heard of. And you always sort of have those in tandem. And I think Azura, there are so many sick now in Jerusalem. It is like the guys that opened Machne Yehuda, right? Off the chain.
The restaurant Machne
Yehuda.
Yeah.
In Machne Yehuda
that's
Market.
a great restaurant. Yep.
Amazing.
Yeah.
But there's also the restaurant Azura that's been there since the 50s that is like sick, that has got Kurdish, Turkish, super old school Sephardic. I mean, Spanish Sephardic. Their sofrito is like
I had
amazing.
fool, I had hummus, I had lamb shank, and then that soup. What is the soup?
Kube, right?
Kube.
With the dumplings.
Yeah,
so sick.
Amazing.
Dude, have you had the stuffed eggplant there?
Yes, definitely have.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So like there's nothing that competes with that, right? You can't touch that because that's got like the right amount of grandmother, and it's got like all the grandmothers that make up Israeli food. And then you've got it, they're like cooking these paraffin burners.
I love that. It's like an outdoor, you could find it in Korea or Mexico City. It's
exactly.
like a similar vibe.
Exactly. And then it's right next to like where all the Iraqi old dudes, the old heads, they play sheshbesh, they play backgammon, and they're like yelling at each other. the whole time, you know, and it's just amazing.
And
So
soldiers are there. I love
Yeah.
seeing the soldiers eating their food, and
everybody eats there. It's sick.
I want to go back to Jerusalem just to eat it at Azura. I love that restaurant so much.
Yeah.
Your chapters are really cool. Like the way you have a whole chapter for falafel, you have a whole chapter for pita, you have a whole chapter for sabich.
Yeah, totally.
Tell me about that dish.
So sabich is like this amazing. So it's cool because that's actually the most Israeli dish of all, right?
Less known, though, I would say.
Less known, and then you go there and you're like, where did this came from? Iraq, right? Well, the truth is that it there's no sabich sandwich as far as I know in Iraq. What there is tabit, which is the version of like the overnight Sabbath preparation that like the Iraqi Jews made. Because everybody that's Jewish, the way that they cook is by like basically shutting off equipment on Friday, right? Or keeping ovens at a constant heat, right? So tabit is like rice, chicken, eggplant, and hard-boiled eggs that's like cooked sort of in one pot overnight. There was a guy that apparently invented the sabich sandwich. And so what he did was the next morning he took his tabit, he took out the eggplants, he took out the hard-boiled eggs, he stuffed them in a pita with tahina and amba, which is the Iraqi mango pickle, similar to the Indian mango pickle. And then he put it in a pita, which is what actually making it portable is what makes it like Western, right? Because we got to like get work done and like run around and talk on our cell phones, smoke cigarettes, drive, and eat our sandwiches, right? Same thing with falafel. Falafel certainly wasn't invented by Israelis, but stuffing it inside of a pita, marketing it that way, very Western, right?
Yeah.
It's like the bagel sandwich here in the States. The bagel sandwich didn't exist in Poland, right? So that's and it was created, I think, in the early '60s. I believe the first sabich like sandwich place was in like Ramat Aviv, I think, or Ramat Sharon. I don't even somewhere just outside of Tel Aviv.
Let's talk about amba, because I think that's something that's really interesting to me. When I have that sandwich, it's like, what is this brightness? What is this kind of
like
X
mango
factor?
pickle? Like it's crazy, right?
Mango,
it's like sweet, sour, fermented, but it's also got fenugreek, so it's got like Indian curry sweet, you know, and it goes really well with fried things. Yeah, it was brought to Israel, I believe, by the Iraqi Jews. You can look at the proximity. The sort of Baghdadi Jew, like the Iraqi Jews and the Indian Jews had a lot going on. Obviously, spice trade was one of those things, and you can see a lot of influences. Lafa, the bread that is popularized now that we cook at Zahav, that is Iraqi, very similar in the way that it cooks, the way that it tastes to naan, right? So, yeah, man, mango pickle is sick. We make a couple versions of it in Israeli Soul, not using mangoes. Like in the spring, we use like strawberries.
Yeah,
which are pretty dope.
I want to talk about schnitzel. My father-in-law says all Israeli restaurants should be judged by their schnitzel. But schnitzel is not something I think about with Israeli cuisine, at least in the modern press. But it's super important to Israeli foodways.
I mean, again, this goes back to like when there was not this is when like Israeli couscous was being made, and that was basically to suffice all of the Sephardic, all of the Mizrahi, all of the like sort of Arab Jews and there was no rice. So they were like, Ben Gurion was like, we have to make
Ben Gurion's rice.
We got to make rice, you know. So there you go, Israeli couscous, and the schnitzel too. Same thing. It was like chicken is what is available, and we got to bread this up and like turn this into something too. And obviously, schnitzel came from like Austria, but if you've ever been to Israel, you realize, schnitzel has transcended everything.
It's
basically.
like the slice in New York.
Yeah,
you'll find it in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or any other Haifa.
Well, it's also what my dad, like when we grew up in Pittsburgh and when my mom would like not make my lunch and my dad would, it was like buttered schnitzel sandwiches. So sick.
What do you like in a schnitzel sandwich? What makes a good schnitzel sandwich for you?
Honestly, I mean, I like every kind of schnitzel sandwich, but to me, schnitzel sandwich is one thing. I mean, schnitzel with like rice and tahina is like the best way to eat it, like in a gas station, Totally. In Israel, like the best. But I think a schnitzel sandwich in pita with minimal toppings is the way to go. Freshly fried or alternatively cold. I like cold schnitzel sandwiches on a Martin's potato roll with tahina, za'atar, and tomato. Dude, I like that. At the beach, it is sick.
Oh, it's so good.
So good, yeah.
It's kind of like the southern fried chicken sandwich with that roll, but
exactly
pure Israeli style.
Dude, it's so good.
Oh, man.
We make it at Federal Donuts sometimes. It's like delicious.
Let's talk about you bring up your father, and your father owned Subways, like the restaurant chain.
He did, yeah.
Dude, what was that like having your dad own a Subway? You must have been pretty cool.
Well, I was not that cool because first of all, he opened one when I was, I guess, in middle school. And I thought that was cool because of the Otis Spunkmeyer cookies. He was a jeweler before that. And then I ended up like having to work there at a super young age, so it wasn't that cool. But yeah, I mean, it was fun. I like the Subway model was like pretty interesting. And if you look at the way that they have sort of organized themselves, I find it to be like fascinating now, you know?
I bring it up because I want to talk about the restaurant culture in you and like the entrepreneurial spirit in you, because you've got this thing, Goldie.
Yeah.
This falafel shop that I think, honestly, on the record, that is like the next Subway. It could be the next Subway. It is amazing.
I appreciate that. I mean, I think that we make fresh bread. And that's actually funny that you say that, because I think that one of the powers of the sort of magic of Subway was the fact that they would like bake their bread, you know?
That smell, you walk in, right?
Exactly. And it was like very vegetable heavy in terms of like fast food, right? So Goldie is vegan, even though we don't like call it a vegan restaurant. We make the pitas, and the falafel are like super fresh, and it's like tahini salad. We do like French fries, and then we do like these tahini milkshakes.
These shakes, man,
which are sick, and those are a mixture of almond and like a little bit of soy and tahini.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit. So you're basically doing these ridiculous, these vegan sandwiches that aren't vegan. You're doing fries, and you're doing this milkshake, which is also vegan.
Yeah.
But I've been there 3 times in Philadelphia at your restaurant. There's only one of them, right?
Now we actually have 3.
You have 3, so you've been growing. I'm telling you, there's going to be 3,000 pretty soon. But this milkshake, this tahini milkshake, is one of the best things I've ever had. This best desserts I've ever had, and it's so rich and creamy, but it's vegan.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah.
But you give the recipe away in your book.
Yeah, we do.
So what is the recipe?
We give the recipe away for everything in our book. I mean, pita is in our book. I mean, all of it's in our book. So, I think that we teach people how to use ice cubes in a blender to make this tahini milkshake, which are amazing.
But you're doing it in like an industrial machine.
We have a milkshake machine, It's not even like a secret. We just have the right equipment, And I think that, as we all know or should know, it's like not the recipe. It's the attention to detail and consistency every single day that differentiates like a home cook with a restaurant.
So it's tahini, almond milk, and sugar.
Yeah, and
mixed
I think there's soy in there too.
Oh, there's soy milk too?
Okay. I believe so. Maybe not. Maybe it's just almond. And it's awesome. And then we do a couple of different toppings, and they're great.
You mix them in. Where do you see Goldie going?
I mean, I think like you, I think that we should probably open a lot of them. I don't know. What do you think?
I think so. I'm like just really love that food, and I want to eat it all the time.
Yeah, I mean, it's really like fresh and delicious, and everything is kind of handmade. And I don't know, good falafel is like hot, fresh falafel is just the way to go.
I close all of our interviews with the question, what is your dream cookbook? You've made 2 of them so far. So what's the next cookbook for you? The next book, I could say?
It's hard to say. I mean, we were thinking about, I don't know, there's a couple different ways that we could go probably with. I'd like to write an actual book. I think that would be fun, and use recipes and cooking as sort of like a way to guide or structure the chapters. I think like almost anecdotally, that would be fun. I don't think I would have to retire though, because I don't, cookbooks are hard. Yeah, I mean, like Steve does essentially all the writing, and I do a lot of the dictating, and he does all the editing, and we have Dorothy Kalins, who really is the magic, and Don Morris, who puts together the design and the sort of feel, and Mike Persico, who shoots it all. So, a book like this I'm a very small part of it. I'm like, hey guys, let's go to Israel, basically. But I don't know, a book, like I would like to just get in a car and just go. I would like to pick a coast somewhere, could even be in this country, and sort of start at the bottom and then go, start at the top and go to the bottom, or vice versa, and just pick up food and cook it.
Seafood perspective?
I think seafood would be good, but even foraging. I mean, Oregon is a very inspiring place, and I could see doing that. I think it would be really nice if it was sort of like Endless Summer meets something. Mike Persico, who shot the book, is taught me how to surf, actually. And I think it would be great to just get in. He's like El Camino. And just like get in that and drive down a coast and just cook food and cook it outdoors and surf and hike and forage and that kind of thing. I think that would be fun.
Buy that.
Or at
Mike
least
Solomonov, thank you for joining the Taste Podcast.
Thanks, bro.
Here I am talking to Dana Frank and Andrea Slonaker, the authors of Wine Food. So my first question, your book is wine food. Is there really such a thing as wine food, or is all food kind of wine food?
Interesting question. We actually asked ourselves that a lot while we were writing the book. Things that are spicy are often considered like not appropriate for wine, and we often turn to beer. But we found that certain levels of heat go really well with certain types of wine. A little bit of residual sugar in the wine will help with, balancing the heat. And Dana, do you want to talk about like some of the wines that go well with spicy food?
Yeah, I mean, definitely when we think about things like Riesling and Gewürztraminer, Malvasia, like very aromatic grape varieties that happen to be generally made with a little bit of residual sugar to go with spicy foods are great. But we also found things like we have a whole chapter in the book on brunch, and all paired with different kinds of wines. And so again, like not something that people often think of beyond a mimosa, but there's all of these great wines that can go with brunch and breakfast foods too. So there's sort of the idea was to sort of say all food can go with wine, or all types of food can go with wine, for sure.
We did find a few instances where it just didn't work.
I was going to ask, what is something you absolutely would not eat with wine?
A lot of Mexican food I don't think goes well with wine.
It's challenging, yeah.
There's something, especially like corn tortilla. We really struggled to find wines that like really matched the flavors that you find with tortillas. Like we tried to do that with a recipe, and it didn't work at all. We're not doing tortillas.
Why
it just didn't work.
That is? What is it about tortillas that's
it's just
so
like
tough?
It's like you want beer with that food. It just makes so much more sense.
Yeah, there's kind of like the floury corn taste kind of
something
plays
maybe
off
with the nixtamalization. I don't know.
Yeah, the process of actually making a tortilla from masa, I'm not sure. But we do have we have an aguachile recipe that we pair with vermentino, and that goes amazingly well together. Just the idea of like kind of chilled, fresh seafood with, lime and avocado, that goes really well. But the tortilla thing really threw us off, for sure.
And then like a lot of foods that are classically said to not go with wine, like tomatoes are a challenge. We found some interesting pairings for those. Like we did a tomato salad that goes really well with Gewürztraminer, which I think a lot of people are going to be surprised to see. And then like artichokes is another thing that classically does not pair with wine. And some people say that the only wine that pairs with artichokes is Provençal rosé, but I still don't think that works. We tried that so hard, and it just there's something in the flavor of artichokes, whether it's an enzyme or something, I don't know, but it just doesn't work.
What would you normally drink with artichokes then, if not wine?
I don't know.
A cocktail,
water.
Yeah, I didn't know that about tomatoes, like specifically raw tomatoes.
Yeah, it's just, I think because of their like natural sweetness and acidity, people find it really challenging to put wines with them. Really, really challenging.
And there's kind of like a savory undertone too. It's
like
that
umami
sweet, but
thing.
Also,
yeah, exactly.
I see a lot of articles these days that are like wine pairings to go with every flavor of Lifesaver or Halloween candy or whatever absurd thing. Do you think we've gone too far with wine pairings?
I mean, I do think there's certain things that just don't go with wine. Like I, don't think that chocolate and wine go together. And that has often been like a red wine with chocolate or, with strawberries. And it's like those things don't like each other at all. There's certain wines that go with chocolate, but, they're like sweeter wines for the most part. But just like a red, like Cabernet and chocolate do not like each other.
Yeah. So it has to have a little residual sugar in it as well. Like Banyuls.
Yes,
is
Banyuls
actually the
from
one
the south of France.
Red wine from the south of France that I think goes really well with chocolate cake.
But it has some sweetness to it. It's very, very ripe. But yeah, I think I've had a couple of people reach out and ask if I want to do some wine pairings for like, things made with weed. And it's like, I just think like maybe it's gone a bit over the edge, with pairing candy and marijuana and things like that.
Yeah.
With wine.
What's the point is kind of the question.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I love that your book kind of breaks outside of the model of what people expect to go really well with wine. Like, you think of like a wine party in the 90s and like serving cheese and chocolate, as you said. So what were like some of the misconceptions that you were kind of trying to nudge people away from with this book? And like, what are some of the recipes in the book that just people would never think of to pair?
Well, I would say one that they're not necessarily misconceptions, but it's exactly what you said, is that a lot of the books that we had looked at when we started writing the proposal and thinking about doing this book were things that were just a bit outdated, and they made sense in the 90s. But now the way people cook, the way we shop, very like thinking very much about farmers markets and cooking with a lot of worldly ingredients and spices, it just made sense to do something that felt a lot more modern and more fresh. So, I don't think any of the old like Pinot Noir and salmon and roast chicken and Chardonnay are necessarily misconceptions, but we just wanted to say like, okay, there's all of these other things that you can do too. So
what will be like 20 or 30 years from now, what will be the thing that that generation will be making fun of us for pairing for wine?
Oh my gosh.
With wine?
What do you think?
They'll be like, oh, my mom used to have these cocktail parties.
Yeah. I don't know. Hopefully they'll look back and be like, my parents were so cool and they nailed it.
Yeah, that's really where this is going.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can't really think of anything. I mean, we just think everything right now is just so cool. So it's hard to predict what's not going to be cool in 20 years. But
exactly.
I don't know. Maybe they'll make fun of our obsession with rosé.
Right, or something like that.
It's kind of like coming full circle because our parents drank rosé out of a box. And they called it blush.
Right.
And now, it went through a couple decades at least of not being cool, and now it's like all the rage and everyone's rosé all day and all that. And so I think that's already starting to like become a little like, okay, we get it, everyone likes rosé, let's kind of move on.
Right.
But
yeah, for sure. What about the obsession with natural wine? That's kind of like a huge trend that I'm seeing now. And a lot of just kind of like a lot of people don't know what natural wine is necessarily, and it can mean so many different things.
Yeah. It's very challenging right now. We're at a challenging time in wine, thinking specifically about natural wine, because there is no actual definition of what it is. And so it's sort of everybody's own interpretation of what it can be, whether you're a winemaker or you're a wine drinker or a buyer. So I tend to not think of it as a trend, because people have been making wines naturally without any additives for so long that I don't think it's a trend. I think it's just something that now people are really paying attention to. Will it always have as much hype as it does right now? Probably not. It'll probably settle down, is my guess. But hopefully people will continue to pay attention to it, because like any sort of agriculture, the better we are to, the soils and the earth, and, we watch what we're putting in our bodies, the better it is all the way around. So hopefully, the hype dies down a little bit, but we still pay attention to these kinds of wines. I think it's important.
Yeah, it seems to be kind of like a revolution right now. If you think about like when everyone started talking about organic food and like wanting organic food, natural food, it's like that's kind of like finally catching up in the wine world. And so, yeah, there's a lot of talk about it right now. But hopefully, I think the goal would be that it just becomes commonplace that people just want their wine to not have a bunch of additives in it and make it, kind of the old style. Non-industrial. I mean, that's always going to be there, of course, just like industrial food is always there. But hopefully it just kind of gets more into the mainstream.
Absolutely.
When I think of natural wines, I think of kind of like the slightly effervescent, funky natural wines. Do you think we're moving into a direction of having like a little more language to talk about that, like on a consumer level, just like kind of describing what people like in that category?
I do. And I think that those kinds of natural wines that are funky and fizzy represent like a very tiny scope of the natural wine world. That there are so many tremendous natural wines that are made in a very classic way where, the average person would drink them and be like, oh, this is just a tasty wine. There's nothing funky about it. There's nothing weird going on with it. But it just so happens that grower works organically or biodynamically and doesn't add anything in the cellar. And they make more of a classic style wine. So I think that just represents a very small portion of the wines that are being made.
I think maybe the people making wines like that too are the ones that are really screaming natural wine,
exactly.
And the people who are making it more classically are like, this is how we've always made it. Like they don't really see the need to scream from the rooftops, this is natural wine.
Absolutely.
Right.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I have a question because I'm kind of like a wine idiot. How, like, if I'm walking into a wine store, what's the best way to kind of like make a decision or learn a little bit more about wine?
Well, I think your first how you're approaching it is perfect. You walk into a wine shop versus like a grocery store because you're going to get more personal attention going into a wine shop.
And in New York State, there's no wine in grocery stores.
Okay. Right.
It's only like Chateau Diana.
Okay.
So we have to go into a liquor store or a wine store to buy it here.
So I would say maybe in New York going into like a, place that is really known for wine versus the bodega that, or whatever has some wine on the shelf, but going into like a, very specific wine shop, I think is the first thing.
Yeah. And then just kind of, making that your regular spot. Maybe it's in your neighborhood, just finding your shop and getting to know the shopkeeper. We kind of talk about this in the book about, exactly what you're asking, like how do you kind of immerse yourself? So get to know the shopkeeper. That shopkeeper will get to know you and get to know your preferences and start recommending things to you. And you can really start a conversation with them and, dive deeper with the learning about the wine and your own taste.
I loved that in your book at the back, you have a list of wine stores all across the country. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm from Buffalo. You even included a wine store.
Yeah, exactly.
I was very impressed. Was it hard to do that research? Like, how did you wind up gathering those?
Luckily, we both travel a lot. And, especially within the wine market, we're constantly going to different cities and places. And, it's a community. So you hear about places in, Detroit or, Orcas Island, Washington.
Yeah.
So, it's the community of wine is pretty tight. So the research wasn't too difficult. But yeah, we wanted to be really conscientious of covering, all different parts of the country because it does seem like wine and natural wine is kind of focused in New York and, San Francisco and places like that. But, it's available all over the place. So we wanted to make sure that we gave options for everyone who, could get their hands on the book.
Mm-hmm.
Are there parts of the country that kind of aren't known for their wine, but that are doing interesting things with wine right now? Or
I would say the Midwest for sure. There's not, if there, I think there's grapes grown all over. I'm not sure about, what's happening in the Midwest, but I think looking at Chicago and Minneapolis, I think there's some really great things happening with wine shops and wine bars and restaurants that focus on natural wine. So I think that's a place that's maybe not on everyone's radar. That part of the country, like we always think of the coasts for sure. Mm-hmm. But I think there, and then in the South, there's a bunch of great places. In the Carolinas, New Orleans is like an amazing city for wine drinking. Nashville. So, some places that we don't think of for wine necessarily, but are doing very cool things.
I would imagine with wine more than maybe with liquor or beer, it's hard to have like brand loyalty to certain makers just because so much depends on region and season, and there's so much variation across the industry. But do you find yourself kind of like becoming loyal to certain makers or just finding makers that are doing really interesting things?
Yeah, absolutely. With every recipe and wine recommendation in the book, we give a list of like 5 to 8 different producers from, all over the world, people who are consistently making delicious wines that we want to drink. And yeah, I think that the producer is a very important part of choosing your wine.
And I think the importer also, and we also have a list in the book of importers to know, because if you just turn the bottle around and look at the importer label on the back, that can tell you a lot of information. And there are, 15 to 20 amazing importers that work with natural wines where the wines are available, across the United States, maybe not in every state, but all across the country. And you can sort of rely on those importers. Like if you don't know the wine, but you see their name on the back label, you know that you're in pretty good hands. So I think also, knowing importers and shopping by importer is great.
For sure. And knowing which stores those importers work with.
Yes, exactly.
When you are cooking with wine, is there kind of like a different set of decisions when you're picking out a wine to cook with?
How much do I want to drink it while I'm cooking?
Yeah. So cooking with wine, that's a great question. There's the old adage that you should cook with the wine you're going to drink. But if you're going to drink like a really nice bottle of wine, maybe you don't want to pour half of the bottle into your soup pot or whatever it is. So we say that you should cook with a wine that you would be happy to drink. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the wine that you're going to drink later, because it does, in the cooking process, the wine is transformed. It's not going to have all of the nuances and all the flavors that are going to be in your glass of wine that you're going to drink later. So just make sure it's a quality wine that you're cooking with to begin with.
Because the flavors do concentrate. And so if you start with a really crappy wine, that's just going to concentrate in the dish. So it's like starting with a really the worst, a terrible cut of meat or, some moldy old tomatoes and throwing them in your pot.
And making it worse.
Yes. And yes, exactly. You still want to start with something that is quality.
Yeah. And I actually keep bottles of wine that, are open and maybe not completely drunk and keep them in my fridge. And that becomes my cooking wine, over the next week or so.
That's what I do. That's where all of my leftover half-drunk bottles from parties go.
Exactly.
I was going to ask you also, what are there other things that you like to do with leftover wine? Or what about, a half-drunk bottle of champagne that's kind of flat at the end of a...
That's unfortunate. Don't let that happen.
Okay, that's the first rule.
Drink it. Yeah. Champagne's difficult because the bubbles go away.
Right.
And no, I know, make vinegar. We're not that crafty.
I've never made vinegar before, but I do know people that do that save their old, wine and make vinegar out of it, but cook with it.
Cook with it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. What sorts of things would you cook with champagne?
You could make an amazing braised chicken dish.
Ooh.
With
that's a good idea.
Cream, champagne chicken. That sounds kind of awesome.
I love that. Mm-hmm. Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What's interesting is that champagne, spends before it gets bubbles the second time around, for the second fermentation, it starts as a still wine. And so it's really interesting to taste champagne flat, even though in your mind you're like, this doesn't taste right because it doesn't have bubbles. But if you didn't know any different, that, is that wine started its life as a still wine at some point. So I think, you could, if it's totally flat, you could substitute it in for any number of white wines that you would use in a dish, actually.
I never thought about that, just being kind of totally tricked by the absence of bubbles.
And then thinking, I can't drink this wine. But actually, if you didn't know it was bubbly, you would probably drink it.
Yeah.
If you didn't know it was bubbly to start, you would probably drink it. Yeah.
I noticed in your introduction, you talk a little bit about just specific moments of pairing that kind of inspired you to write the book, like eating a delicious olive oil drenched fish on an island in Croatia, for instance. Do you think there are wine pairings that are that depend on the situation as well as the food? Do you ever find yourself pairing certain wines with certain occasions?
Thank you for asking that, because that's actually the premise of the entire book. We set out to write a book that wasn't just about pairing the wine and the food, but considering the third component, which is the moment and the season and the time of day and who you're with. And so that is absolutely perhaps the most important part of it. Sunny July afternoon on your patio, what kind of wines make sense? What kind of food makes sense? You're not going to want to drink a really heavy Barolo with a big bowl of pasta. You want to have something like cold fried chicken with chocolate, that kind of thing. So absolutely, that's very important. And that's really what we wanted to kind of bring to the forefront with the pairing idea.
Mm-hmm.
What should I drink this weekend? A beautiful fall weekend in New York?
Is it going to be humid?
Oh, probably.
So we have a forbidden rice bowl in the book that's done with salmon and then this lovely cucumber salad. And we pair it with Gruner Veltliner from Austria. So I feel like for this time of year, for the weather in New York, that would be great because, I don't know, for me personally, I wouldn't be ready for like hot, cozy food this weekend, even though it's fall. And I feel like Gruner Veltliner has, it has some acidity and some brightness to it, but it also can have really wonderful body and texture. And so it's kind of a nice wine for this time of year. And it, allows you to like cook something and play with a recipe in the book, but not have like hot food coming out of the oven.
Thank you so much. I've learned so much about wine, guys. Thanks for coming in.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
The Taste podcast is hosted by Matt Rodbard and me, Anna Heasel. The show is produced by Gabrielle Lewis, studio recordings by Pat Stango, theme music by Steve Rydell. Interviews are recorded live at Books Are Magic in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn, and at Penguin Random House Studios in Manhattan. Visit Taste online at tastecooking.com. Thanks for listening.